So let's go to the more important things. So MVC. So MVC, MVC stands for Model View Controller. So I want to spend a little time talking about this because this is the dominant metaphor for web and mobile programming. So if there's one design pattern you need to really think about and understand the limitations and the affordances of, it's this one. And it'll explain why you have to do things in certain places when you get to web programming, okay? So it's worth thinking about deeply. So why do this? So when people were starting to build interactive applications, back when it was even like, you know, a console and a server, a mainframe and your little thin console, they realized that they needed to figure out a pattern, a way to solve what was happening where. And they came up with this MVC idea. And the idea is that it helps these things. It helps separate your code so that you're not trying to solve one problem in two places. It helps keep your data storage separate from like how you represent it to people. Because if you tie those together, you end up in spaghetti code land very quickly. It can sometimes facilitate code reuse, which is any good pattern should do that. And it's sort of the separations of concerns design pattern where like, you shouldn't have to deal with one thing when you're dealing with another, you know? Like I shouldn't have to worry about the database, so I'm just trying to like add an image to something so that people can see it. So this is why. The what, I can explain with this diagram, but it's actually much easier to explain with, which you've come to probably get used to me saying now, with some Legos and some people. I have Legos. I need 4 people to stand up front. Someone fall down? Oh. Looks like there's help. So I need 4 people to stand up front, and like I said, I'll edit this out. Volunteers. Thanks. That is the essence of Model View Controller, okay? The idea that the model over here manages talking to the database, and nobody else talks to the database directly. That's a big deal. The idea that the controller right here is actually kind of thin, like no offense, I mean, I didn't mean like you're thin, like you don't have a lot of logic in it. Like you just sort of ask everybody else to do the work for you as much as you can. You're like, hey database, do this stuff for me. You're kind of lazy. View, just figure out, here's the stuff you need, figure out how to show it. The view is where all these templates live. And the view basically takes information that they've gotten from the controller and says, hey, okay, I've got a hole here on my template. I'm waiting for the right information. I'm going to render it right there. Whatever it gives me, I'm going to try to render. And then I get what gets returned back. The router, your only job was to turn URL requests into what controller they go to. And pass along the args, make sure the args were valid. So we'll see in a minute, almost every single web architecture you use has this baked in. Like it has controllers that you need to extend, it has models that you need to extend, it has a router that you have to deal with, and it has views, right? And they call them that, right? It's true of Rails, it's true of Django, it's true even of things like Drupal, it's true of Flask. It's just true of like every single one of them. It's true of Meteor. It's just the case that every single web framework uses this. Or every single web framework you are like likely to use, 99% of them, uses this as its main thing. Now, in Rails, they call the model active record, but it's the same thing. So that's why it's so critical to understand it. It's also critical to understand it because like it's actually turned out to be a pretty good way. There's varieties of it that are a little different, like Model View Controller, which I think Microsoft came up with, that's a little bit different. It's also true that in mobile space, this is exactly the same. If you're writing an Android app, well, yeah, the names are a little bit different. In iOS, the names are pretty close to it. Pretty close to the same. But the concepts are the same, right? So in Android, you have the standard pattern is to write a data source that is basically a wrapper around accessing the database. You write a Java object model, which handles all getting stuff out of that and parsing it and saving it. And then your controller is more sure your activity, which marshals getting stuff and then renders it to XML with the XML template, right? It's the same damn thing. So it's just everywhere. Now, this is sort of a nerdier way to explain it in this flowchart, right? It's the view, so the user imagine a desktop application, right? So a user clicks a record on a list, the controller figures out what record they want, makes sure they're allowed to, asks the model to load it. The controller might clean up the fields, like localized time and stuff like that for the user. Or actually, maybe the view will do that, but it'll like put their name there so that the user's ready. And the view will render it into a template, right? So this is how desktop software works as well. The cool thing here, and the really important thing, is that just trust me that it really helps to make sure that things like that you don't jump over things, right? So often you'll see shortcuts where people are like, oh, I forgot something. I'm in the view and I forgot to load something out of the database. I'm just going to grab it right now, right? This is a mistake that sort of I made as an introductory programmer a lot. As soon as you start breaking that design, it becomes really hard to manage your code. Just really, really hard. And you just need to trust me and like all the other developers who have done this on that. So it's really useful to, like, if you've forgotten something, to go over to the model, make sure the model loads it correctly, make sure the controller asks for it correctly, and gets it back to you in the view. I'm a lazy coder in a lot of ways. I'm not a lazy coder in that way. It's just burned me too many times. You'll see some architectures, which I will insult freely, that don't follow that, and they lead to really super messy code that's hard to maintain, hard to write, and hard to package up for other people to use. So one of the reasons that large architectures use this pattern even more intensely is that it matters more when you have more people working on your project and when your project does more things. Okay? How are we doing on time? 10 minutes, all right. Let's see. Right, okay, so I talked about this, what the model stores your data and the logic you need to use it. So like models are usually thick. People talk about thick models. Like a lot of business logic is pushed into models often, like whether you're checking things, how you order them, sometimes it's pushed into there. The controller sort of takes the input, gets the models, cleans them up and sends them to the view renders it. Like I said, people disagree often quite strongly about where exactly you draw the line, but you get the general pattern. Right, so why do you need to know this? This is baked in everywhere. So Rails has models using controllers. That's a web architecture we'll talk about in a minute. iOS, which we'll talk about on Wednesday, has core data to manage them, UI view subclasses, which are the views, and view controller is like the controller. In-browser JS frameworks use this a lot too, so we'll talk about that today. Like Backbone has it. What do you call it? The one that Meteor uses, which now I'm forgetting the name of, which I'll remember as soon as I show you the code. They use it too. So the big, I was talking about how sort of the thing that talks to the database uses this. As we'll talk about in a minute, you can also sort of write your whole application in a browser and do that in JavaScript and architect that as an MVC framework, and then just get data from the server, not have a controller or anything from the server. We'll talk about that in a sec. MVC dominates. So I talked about this a little bit. So your model represents the data. It has data and business logic. One thing that can happen, which is a little subtle twist, is that sometimes you can like dispatch, if you're looking at something and it changes on the server, the data, sometimes your model will get an event saying the data changed, and then we'll have to like percolate a change up to the view so that it changes on your screen without you having to like reload or anything. So you'll see that in some of the libraries if you start to dig into this stuff. Skinny controller is the glue, like we talked about, and this is key here, this idea that you have these templates which have spaces to fill in, right? So when you're rendering something on a web page, you basically write your whole architecture and then you basically put a thing that says data goes here, or like for each data that comes in, a row goes here. And then it just uses the actual data that's loaded to render itself, whether it's a list of everybody in the class or just the people sitting in the second row, it uses the same template, right? You have like a template that knows how to write a list of people in the class, right? Just like the base plate was a template for whatever tower you wanted to put onto it and knew how to show it, okay? So now I've repeated myself a sufficient number of times that I think I'll go on to the next thing.